There are 195 countries in this world, but there may potentially be more in the future. Hello everyone, my name is Takuyi, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's video, we're going to be diving into a rather interesting topic, as this isn't going to be a pure history video. No, you've probably already seen it from the title, but the thing that we're going to be talking about here today is countries that might exist in the future. One of the projects that I've considered doing on this channel is a history of the entire world, every single country that exists, but over the course of doing research for that project, I simultaneously realized that there are a number of countries in this world that may cease to exist, almost. And in the case of others, there are several potential new countries that may appear here within the next couple years. And so for today's video, I thought, hey, why don't we go ahead and explore that? But in order to talk about these countries that may exist in the next couple years, it's important that we establish some key points of information before going into it. Where are these potential countries located? What is the history behind this location in the first place? And from that, why will these locations potentially become new countries? But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into things. Here are 3 countries that do not technically exist, but might exist in the future. One of the most troublesome things that occurs here on the History of Everything is that with me having to cover quite literally everything, I have to be very careful about my news coverage. And that, my friends, is precisely why I use a service like Ground News, something that allows me to get more balanced coverage from different sources from all around the world about different topics. Like as an example, one of my favorite things that I love to cover on this channel is geopolitics, and really, nothing in this world gets as incredibly messy as geopolitics. Considering how many things I have been covering in Africa as of late, Ground News is an incredibly valuable source because I can go and find an article on, say, Burkina Faso's junta, and I am able to organize the information I can obtain by accessing the left-wing, right-wing, or center sources from all the varying different aspects that are revealed on here. I can see the approximate factuality of the sources that I'm obtaining information from, and I can also see what the ownership of those sources are to know whether or not they are a private corporation or perhaps state-owned media. Really, Ground News is an incredibly valuable resource for me, and one of the things that I love about it is Blind Spot, which allows me to be able to see what kind of news stories are being covered only by certain sources, to be able to show what biases exist within certain stories. I promise you, for anyone who has been watching my channel and wants to stay informed, Ground News is easily one of the greatest things that you can possibly get in your life. So my friends, please go to ground.news/history of everything and start getting access to all sides of every story. And if you check it out and subscribe through my link down in the description, then you can get 30% off said subscription. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring this video. And now back to the show. First one on this list, New Caledonia. Now, for anyone who does not recognize New Caledonia off the top of their head, I completely understand that. This is one of the most special collectivities of France, and it is located in the South Pacific. New Caledonia is an archipelago in Melanesia, and it is something that is made up of several different islets. Its name was inspired by the Latin name for Scotland, which is Caledonia, which was once part of the British kingdom of Strathclyde, and is probably named after Caledon, who was an ancient Celtic king in what is now northern England. Now, technically speaking, this small overseas territory still belongs to France, as it was all part of the French Empire, but that is something that may actually soon change. This small area has long been fighting for independence, and back in 2018, a vote for independence was defeated, but a recent 2020 vote for independence was only lost by a very small margin. Another vote since then did happen, but that is something that is a severe point of controversy and is something that we're going to need to explain in this video because it is quite a confusing thing. But in order to explain that, I'm going to need to explain some of New Caledonia's history in the first place. If we are going back and looking at New Caledonia's earliest history, this is something that was first settled by the agricultural and seafaring Lapita people who were there as far back as 1300 BC. The Lapita are thought to be relatives of modern-day Polynesians, Melanesians, as well as Micronesians. Fast forward quite a large amount of time, and Captain Cook would end up first citing and naming New Caledonia its modern name in 1774, but at the time, Europe didn't necessarily care about this area, not really until 1840, when sandalwood traders would come there to harvest trees. And this is where things start to get significantly darker. And no, that's not a pun here, considering what it is that I'm going to be talking about. But it is around the year 1842 that the sandalwood trade gradually begins to die down, and the economy of New Caledonia is instead replaced with something that is more like slavery. Something that would continue from 1842 all the way until the year 1904. Which a number of people are going to look at me confused and go, Stack, wait, hold on, all the way until the 20th century? That doesn't make sense. This is something that was operated by France, and France had outlawed slavery. How would that work? Well, in a process of something that was called blackbirding, people, mainly men from New Caledonia, the Loyalty Islands, and the Southern Pacific Islands, were kidnapped or tricked into working as slaves or workers with extremely low wages, where they were taken back to Australia, to Queensland, in order to work on the sugar plantations. This practice would continue all the way through 1904, with indentured servants being called Kanakas, which is the Hawaiian word for man. The entire thing is incredibly messed up. It is during this time that the region of New Caledonia was captured on behalf of Napoleon III in 1853, and the town of Port-de-France, now known as Noumea, was founded in 1854, after which time a small number of free settlers would arrive. But even though we talk about things with new free settlers arriving simultaneously, they were not the biggest ones. No, in fact, the biggest number of people that came to this island as settlers were not actually settlers, it was a penal colony. France would primarily use New Caledonia as a penal colony, which was established in the 1860s, and around 22,000 convicts would end up getting transported there, whether it was by petty crime or as political prisoners, and they would be there for about 35 years. Simultaneously, it is around this time that the mineral of nickel would be discovered in 1864, which would prompt the establishment of a number of mines, as well as importation of laborers from neighboring islands, Southeast Asia, and Japan, along with increased efforts by the French government to encourage Europeans to migrate to New Caledonia in order to oversee things. The indigenous population was relegated to reservations and mostly excluded from economic activities, which led to a united uprising and civil war. Fast forward a little bit of time, and during World War II, France would end up being occupied by the Germans. At this time, New Caledonia would vote to support Charles de Gaulle and the Free French government, and it would become an important base for the Allies in 1942. The US would actually set up its South Pacific headquarters in Noumea, bringing in 50,000 troops, which, at the time, was equivalent to the entire existing population of the island. New Caledonia then after this would become an overseas territory for France in 1946 with the end of the war, and citizenship would be granted to New Caledonians of all ethnicities. Which really does sound like an interesting thing, especially when you remember that a large percentage of the population there was still the native inhabitants of the region. New Caledonia's original residents, which are collectively known as Kanaks, were a number of different Melanesian tribes with distinct crafts, hunting traditions, clothing, arts, beliefs, building styles, and languages. None of this was the same, and it was never any kind of major united identity. Despite invasion and colonization by the British and French, and the decimation of tribal populations through years of slavery and introduced diseases, a great deal of Kanak culture actually had been preserved over the years. And to this day, 33 different native languages are still spoken in New Caledonia, along with traditional crafts, festivals, and rituals that are still practiced to this day. But despite the resilience of Kanak culture, New Caledonia is still, technically speaking, a French territory, and the European influence is something that can be seen all over the island. In particular, the capital, Noumea, is still something that is referred to as the Paris of the Pacific, something that for the Kanak people at the time, they did not necessarily appreciate this. And those tensions are only something that are only going to get worse. So following the end of World War II, the Kanak nationalist movement would begin in the 1950s. But at the time, most voters would choose to remain a territory in an independence referendum in 1958. The European population of New Caledonia would boom in the 1970s, increasing their ties to France with a renewed focus on nickel mining. And as mining increased in the country, this is something that would only increase the nationalism of the native Kanak people. Because if you fast forward going into the 1970s, when the Kanak-based Front Independiste was being formed, sovereignty over the land, as well as recognition of Kanak cultural identity, was the core of the Kanak demands for autonomy. And this, I have to say, is extremely important, because for anyone who is watching right now, they have to understand that the division of land ownership inside of New Caledonia was stark. It was a stark contrast between the natives and the Europeans. Fewer than 1,000 Europeans owned over 370,000 hectares. And mind you, we're talking about 1,000 Europeans right there. Over half of that land was owned by fewer than 40 families. In comparison to this, around 60,000 native Kanaks would live on only 165,000 hectares of reservations, along with 10,000 hectares of private land. European control of land had increased by over 100,000 hectares between the years of 1945 and 1976, while the reserves had only managed to grow by 36,000. Effectively, what was going on is that the territory was rapidly polarizing into two distinct groups that really had no knowledge or contact with one another, and things were only going to get worse. In the year 1975 to 1976, the land problem on the reserves would become critical due to the economic crisis that was brought about by falling nickel prices and the ensuing recession that would follow. Young, unemployed Canucks would end up returning to the reserves, only to find that there was no land for them. There was nothing that they could do. In 1976, the Canucks would go and ask the French government to recognize their land rights, and in response, the government would undertake a land reform project to, quote, equilibrate the unbalance between Canuck and European land ownership. And the way they did this was relatively simple. They would accomplish this by buying land from the Europeans and give it to the natives. And considering this, one of the most important aspects was specifically the project was supposed to try and recover strong traditional lands of the natives. But then we're going to run into a little bit of a hiccup. In the year 1981, there was a little thing called an election in France, which ended up changing the government, and the new government that came in charge was not exactly pleased with what was going on in New Caledonia. The new administration made it clear that they did not accept the Canucks' global claim to all of the lands in New Caledonia, and the land was not simply going to be returned without any conditions to the traditional claimants. This change, along with the slowness of transfers that had been occurring, only led to more militant actions among the native population. Over the course of the early 1980s, key Canuck leaders ended up being assassinated, which would only lead to escalating violence and dozens of fatalities on both sides. By the end of 1987, the territory had effectively erupted into violence. Roadblocks, gun battles, the destruction of property, all of this culminated in a dramatic hostage crisis on the eve of the presidential elections in France, when pro-independence militants on the island of Ovia would kill 4 gendarmes as well as take 27 hostages. The Canucks wanted a mediator and again a timetable for independence, but the French were having none of it. The military response was swift and brutal. The island was occupied, and the independence movement maintains to this day that villages were ransacked and villagers were tortured in it. 3 Canucks militants would die in custody, and negotiations to avert bloodshed were vetoed by the general commanding the French forces. 19 Canucks would end up dying in the military assault that was done in order to try and rescue the hostages. And from everything that was going on, as well as changes that were occurring within France, the conservative government was simply not able to maintain control. And in May of 1988, François Mitterrand would become the president of France. In an effort to try and avoid civil war, France's new prime minister, Michel Rocard, would bring together members of the FLNKS as well as the RPCR, which are the two respective groups for the natives and the settler-dominated conservative political party, to try and decide the future of the territory. And the result of these negotiations is known as the Matignon Accords. The Accords would herald a 10-year, quote, peace period, something during which the French government would try and address the socioeconomic inequalities of the territory, particularly by promoting development and training programs in the Kanak communities. And in 1988, at the end of this period, the New Caledonians would be asked to choose between whether or not they wanted to be independent or whether they would choose to stay within the French Republic. Following this, then, after 10 years, the Nouméa Accord of 1998 would gradually transfer increasing government responsibility from France over to New Caledonia over a 20-year period. And at the same time, in addition to this autonomy, it would simultaneously allow for 3 different independence referendums. In the first of these votes, which was held in 2018, the outcome of it would be that 57% would vote to stay, while 43% would vote for independence. In the second one, that was held 2 years later, in the year 2020, the gap would start to narrow as 53% would vote to stay with France and 47% would vote for independence, which meant that everything was going to come down to the wire in the third independence referendum, but that is not what happened. In the third referendum that was held in December of 2021, 96% of the population would vote to stay for France, while 4% would vote for independence. And why, you may wonder? Well, because no one showed up to the vote here in the first place. You have to remember that at the time that all of this is going on, COVID-19 is effectively ravaging the world, and the Kanak communities did not feel comfortable going out and voting during all of this and had specifically requested that the French government delay the referendum until things had settled down. But for the French, they refused. So what would end up happening is that all of these different people would end up boycotting the vote, leading to an only 40% turnout, and that's it for the referendum. Something that the native Kanak communities naturally were going to say, hey, this vote was not legitimate. They requested another vote for independence from France, and France went and said no. And this is where things are going to start to get a little bit dicey. Because in February of 2021, pro-independence parties in New Caledonia would, for the first time, gain a majority of seats within the government. This is something that has continued to this day, and now France and New Caledonia officials are still in talks about the status of the country, but as for what will happen, well, everything is a little bit up in the air. Because as it stands with the current government, French President Emmanuel Macron is not exactly keen on letting New Caledonia go. He would actually visit New Caledonia only a few months ago in July of 2023, and would say at the time that he went that, quote, the vote was confirmed by the will of the Caledonians to stay French. And while his government did later acknowledge, hey, yeah, the majority of people absentiated themselves from the vote, simultaneously, they didn't really seem to care. He reaffirmed the vote's outcome and would say that New Caledonia has a role to play in France's Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, that's not to say that France is not going to eventually let New Caledonia go. As it stands, they have left open the possibility of another vote, except in this case, it would be 1 or 2 more generations down the line. So, another 20 to potentially 40 years. But the pro-independence coalition has rejected this timeline. That is not something that they want to do. They describe the 2021 vote as a complete political failure and have been negotiating with Macron's government the entire time on a possible new path to independence. At the same time that they are speaking to the French, pro-independence groups are simultaneously pursuing their claims within the United Nations. The FLKNS, which is the Alliance of Pro-Independence Political Parties, is using the UN as a kind of platform in order to plead that the conditions of the last independence vote means the process of decolonization has not been honored in New Caledonia. The FLNKS also hopes that a member state will refer the issue to the International Court of Justice, but so far it seems that nothing has really happened. Which, looking at all of this, it makes sense as to why France would want to hold on to these territories in the first place. Being realistic, despite the fact that this territory is 17,000 kilometers away from France, it is still extremely rich in resources, like in the case of nickel. Simultaneously, considering the island's position within Asia and what has been going on with China in the past years over their varying claims in the South China Sea, this position is of great geopolitical importance. Interestingly enough, it is the threat of China that is one of the key things that is brought up within political debates in New Caledonia, as people are unsure whether or not independence might be the best choice, considering outside pressures that may come from a more aggressive regional superpower. But really, despite all that, who can say what is actually going to happen? We may, over the next couple years, see a new Pacific island nation with a population under 300,000 people appear in the form of New Caledonia, but nothing has yet been determined. The next one up on this list, though, is possibly even more up in the air. Belgium. Now, okay, I know what a lot of you are going to be saying in the beginning. You're going to be saying, hey, Stack, Belgium is already a country, you dummy. That's already a thing. Well, yes, I know it, but Belgium as we know it may be something that ceases to exist here soon. Not to say that it's going to stop existing entirely, no, just as we know it, it may cease to exist. With the reason being the northernmost part of Belgium, Flanders. Now, I know that the majority of the people who watch my videos are located in the United States, and so to those viewers that are watching this, they may not be aware that this small Western European state that hosts the headquarters of the EU as well as NATO has long been a more dysfunctional state when it comes to its national political life. In fact, interestingly enough, Belgium holds the world record for the longest time taken to form a government during coalition talks, which is over 500 days. That is right, my friends. Belgium effectively did not have a government for over a year. And now it seems that with the strains that exist between the Dutch-speaking Flanders in the north and the French-speaking Wallonia in the south, that the country is facing an even bigger crisis. You see, my friends, elections are due to be held in Belgium in June of 2024. That is only a year away. And the more right-wing oriented Vlaams Belang Party, which wants to turn Flanders into a fully independent breakaway state, is now the biggest political party in the country. This whole thing is absolutely fascinating because the guy that you can see behind me right here is Tom van Grieken, and he is the individual who became president of the Vlaams Belang Party back when he was only 28, and he has been the key to a lot of its recent successes. And maybe it's because of his rather young age, but the man has been exceptionally confident, so much so that he has been firm about his plans for independence if he wins the overall elections. He would say, and I quote, "We believe Belgium is a forced marriage. If one of them wants a divorce, we will talk that out as adults. We have to come to an orderly division. If they don't want to come to the table with us, we will do it unilaterally. And considering the way that the polls have been looking, that is a very real possibility. But okay, to understand exactly why this is happening, we have to go back and look at Belgium's history, because really it does explain everything that is going on here. And this, oh my God, guys, buckle up, because a lot more happened here than even I realized before doing the research going into this video. Okay, first off, the thing that we need to talk about is after the fall of the Roman Empire, which that sounds so weird considering that we're talking about modern political parties, but please, it all makes sense when you look at this. As you can see over on the side here, the land that would go on to form Belgium was at one point in time part of the Holy Roman Empire, and this is something that would stay a part of said empire all the way through the 11th and 12th centuries, as each state within the empire would gradually become more and more independent and achieve its own kind of cultural national identity, so to speak. Over the course of the centuries, the regions within the Holy Roman Empire would gradually break apart into little medieval or small feudal states, and the most renowned ones that would arise in this region were specifically the areas of Hainaut and Flanders, along with the duchies of Limburg and Brabant, and also the Prince Bishopric of Liège. And among all of the states that were over on this side, easily the richest among all of them was the state of Flanders. If we go and fast forward a whole bunch of time, then going until the 19th century, the region of modern-day Belgium was controlled by a variety of different forces. You had the Dutch, you had the Spanish, you had the French, and all of this would continue in a kind of stalemate going back and forth between varying powers until certain events would end up prompting the creation of the new Belgian state. We're going into the early 19th century. Can you guess? Can you guess what kind of event would potentially cause the entire power balance within Europe to shift very suddenly? That's right, it's Napoleon. Napoleon is the guy who would effectively go and break the entire status quo for everything across Europe, and is an individual that would create a buffer state in the Netherlands or the Belgian region, specifically to protect his border with Germany. Over the course of the early 19th century, Napoleon went on a little bit of a conquering spree, and this is something that scared the absolute crap out of basically every kind of power in Europe at the time. Of course, we know that Napoleon was not undefeatable. He was, in fact, beaten in 1815, and his empire was effectively dismantled. Following the defeat of Napoleon in Waterloo, the successful forces of Austria, of Britain, of Russia, of Prussia, they would all meet in Vienna in order to try and redistribute the lands of France that had been conquered and try to arrange the varying jurisdictions of the regions for, well, a long time to come, to try and reset the balance of power within Europe. And perhaps one of the biggest consequential decisions that would be made was to create a united kingdom of the Netherlands, which is the image that you can see over here on the left. The basic idea of it is that they wanted to create a buffer state that would exist between France and, well, the rest of Europe. During the whole Vienna Congress, there was an idea of creating a Belgian state, but this is something that didn't receive enough support over the course of the Congress, and gradually they decided, no, we're going to instead unite all these territories into just one country. They didn't want to run into the risk that the French part of Belgium, as it would be, would end up trying to join with France again, which would just in turn empower France more. And this was not actually the best decision, because what ended up happening is that the sheer amount of agitation and unrest that this would create over the course of 15 years would eventually lead us to the Belgian Revolution. And here's what I mean. The United Kingdom of the Netherlands was effectively divided on a large scale because of the fact that the individuals in the north were basically Protestant, while people in the south were Catholic. Furthermore, there was additional phonetic divisions or linguistic divisions between the Walloons, whose language is French rather than Flemish, whose primary language is Dutch, and in the years to come, this linguistic and religious and cultural difference is going to be one of the primary explanations behind where there would be so much disorder in the Southern territories. So, following these new events of the Belgian Revolution, the powers from the Vienna Congress go and have to meet once again, except this time in London, on the 20th of December 1830, and decide, okay, what are we going to do about this whole thing? Ultimately, considering the sheer amount of success that the revolution had seen immediately from the beginning, there was really nothing that the other powers could have done without direct military intervention that they didn't really want to do. And so, at that point, they pretty much had to accept that Belgium was going to now become a state. But they were going to be able to exert some influence. They insisted that the new Belgium state was not only going to have a king, but that king was going to be from the Saxe-Coburg line. The reason behind that is that they didn't want anyone that potentially could have been affiliated with French interests, because remember everything that had happened with Napoleon in the previous years? And hey, it actually ended up working. Leopold I ended up being welcomed as the King of Belgium on July 21st, 1831, and it is from that day that day would become a public day or holiday in Belgium. Belgium. And so, okay, awesome. From that day onwards in 1831, the Dutch and the French communities finally have their own countries ruled by different kings, and 1831 would fix absolutely everything. Yes, totally, yeah. The only problem is that we would end up seeing in our modern day that is not exactly the case with this new state. You see, here's the problem, if you remember what I was talking about earlier with the modern day divide of Dutch and French within Belgium. Upon Belgium becoming an independent state from the Netherlands, there was a reaction against the Dutch and their language. In an attempt to remove Dutch from the new country, Belgian officials would specifically declare that the only official language in Belgium now was French. The administration, the justice system, the higher education, anything that was apart from simple elementary schools in Flanders, all of these would have to function in the French language. This was so bad that even in a place like Brussels, the capital, in which 95% of the population spoke Dutch, this did not have a formal state-sanctioned Flemish school for higher education. It didn't have any of it. The consequence of that is that every single aspect of governance, every aspect of civil society was something that had to be done in French, something that a large percentage of the population did not speak in the first place. So as you can probably happen when the majority of your population does not speak the language that everything would function in, there were a number of cases where in legal judgments, people that were innocent ended up being executed because they didn't have any way to actually defend themselves or do anything because their language could not be used in a court of law. The result of this is that the French-speaking Belgian government managed to succeed in removing the Dutch language from all levels of the government significantly more quickly in Brussels than in any other part of Flanders. And because of the administration being centered around Brussels itself, more and more French-speaking officials would take up residency there, which would gradually shift the language of the population over time. Education in Brussels was only in French, which means that if you did not learn French, you were not going to get an education, and this naturally means that a whole bunch of young, unskilled, uneducated Flemish men were going to start to fill up the country. And the particularly bad part about all this is that over time, that really started to skew people's perspective on things. The French-speaking bourgeoisie showed very little respect for the Flemish portion of the population. In fact, Belgium's co-founder, Charles Roger, would write in 1832 a letter to Jean-Joseph Rakim, the Minister of Justice, that, quote, "The first principles of good administration are based upon the exclusive use of one language, and it is evident that the only language of the Belgians should be French. In order to achieve this result, it is necessary that all civil and military functions are entrusted to Walloons and Luxembourgers. This way, the Flemish, temporarily deprived of the advantages of this office, will be constrained to learn French, and we will hence destroy bit by bit the Germanic element in Belgium." Which, okay, you can see right there from the very beginning exactly what kind of plan they would have to break the people of their language, but it gets significantly worse because even when it comes to matters of language, people's perspective on other people could become incredibly warped. In the year 1838, there was another co-founder by the name of Senator Alexandre Gandibin, who would even declare that Flemish people were, quote, "one of the more inferior races on the earth, just like the I can't exactly say the word that is used in this here right now, but it is another word that applies to Africans. You can probably guess where I'm going there. Which, okay, yikes, that has to be one of the strongest uses of language I have ever seen when talking about people within your own country. Not even necessarily of a different racial group, just specifically people within your own country and othering them that level. And naturally speaking, because of the repression of the Dutch language, this is something that ended up motivating Flemish nationalism to life, at first mainly as a kind of cultural movement, but then later as a political movement going over the course of the late 19th into the 20th century. Like, here's how bad it was. It was not until the year 1931 that Dutch was actually accepted as an official language within Flanders, despite the fact that it was and still to this day remains the largest language within Belgium. No, it may be something that confuses a number of you, but the French-speaking officials that were in control of the country were actually in the minority of things. Dutch was still the largest language that was spoken over the course of Belgium's history, and it is still that to this day, with 59% of the population being Dutch and another 40% being French. These tensions when it comes to Flemish nationalism are things that would only get worse over the course of World War I and World War II, in which Belgium would become occupied by the Germans. Because prior to this, Belgium hadn't really had to fight very much, but then over the course of the Great War, as it was, the army, which was for the majority of them Dutch or Flemish, you could say, they were forced to, in this time, serve under officers that were French. That is how the system had to work. And so a semi-clandestine Flemish nationalist movement of soldiers called the Front Movement would end up emerging, and this is something that would face severe repression from Belgian officers. The radical part of the Front Movement was explicitly leftist, and its demands included self-government for Flanders. And as the war was coming to an end in late 1918, with an enormous loss of life in the trenches, the Front Movement was agitating for an armed uprising in order to seize control of Flanders by force, but this is something that never actually happened. The radicals did not have the support of the entire movement, as the pacifist section, led by the Catholic conservatives, tried to delay the pursuit of Flemish national demands until after the war in order to solidify their position. But that is something that still didn't really end up happening, and things remained in a kind of status quo until World War II would come about. Because over the course of the Second World War, Belgium was invaded and this time fully occupied. And during this time, some Flemish nationalists would end up collaborating with the Germans, although they were by no means the only collaborators. But this is still something that, because of their involvement with the Germans, that would heavily damage the movement. Post-war, the Flemish movement was tainted by its wartime associations with collaborationism, and because of that, would largely be dormant until going into the 1960s. But then, weirdly enough, the post-war period would effectively see the tables flip between Flanders and Wallonia. Flanders would end up developing a very strong services sector and become a very important international trade hub, the second biggest in Europe, in fact. And now, to this day, Flanders is one of the wealthiest regions in the entire continent. Naturally speaking, at the time, this surpassed Wallonia by some distance, which had gone into a kind of crisis as heavy industry would decline from the 1970s onwards. A steady stream of constitutional reforms would then begin from 1970, and by 1995, Flanders had its own parliament with significant federal powers. The center of political power seems to have at this point shifted in Belgium from south to the north. And this is where things really start to shift. Because with Flanders now the dominant economic region, and with 68% of the Belgian population, this gave them serious political leverage. That means that the politics of Belgium were effectively going to transform. Taxes that were raised in Flanders would pay for social security for people in Wallonia, and this is something that over time would only fuel right-wing sentiments. And as the European Union that it was a part of would grow to include Eastern Europe from 2004 onwards, the immigration of populations that were significantly lower in wealth to wealthy Flanders is only something that would increase. With large numbers of Romanians as well as Poles coming into the country, the people of Flanders were feeling less and less happy with this. At the same time, the French-speaking minority would continue to grow, being supported by government language facilities, generating a lot of frustration within northern Belgium that, hey, despite the fact that we are the majority, we are still being sidelined in favor of this minority in the south. That Dutch was still in decline despite being the official language of Flanders. And what I'm talking about here are only some of the things that we would see that would gradually lead to increased nationalism within Flanders and the rise of more right-wing oriented parties. Now, I'm sure that for many of you who are watching this right now, you are already aware of just how divisive politics can be, particularly when it comes to separations based on geography, nationality, etc., any number of other different factors. But my God, Belgian politics takes this to a whole new level. The gist of it is that in Belgium, there are no real Belgian parties. There are Flemish parties and there are Wallonian parties, but there is nothing that is really Belgian. The only one that we could probably say is the Workers' Party of Belgium, but those are ex-Maoists. They are perhaps the only representatives in the Belgian parliament that the entire focus of their thing is a united Belgian front of like all workers, which on one hand is nice, but then on the other hand, again, ex-Maoists. The rest of the parties, and mind you, again, there are a lot of different parties, can really only claim to represent at most about half of the population. And what ends up happening as a result of that is that there is never any real clear winner when it comes to politics. Politics in Belgium are something that are dominated by coalitions, that being when multiple parties are forced to work together in order to be able to achieve some kind of majority within the government. Which, okay, for some of you listening, that might sound kind of nice, but the reality of it is that because they are forced to try and band a bunch of political parties together that are constantly fighting one another, this means that at any given time within the political system of Belgium, that the entire government could simply fall apart or be unable to actually meet its goal of forming a government in the first place. Which is something that has happened multiple times. From the year 2010 through 2011, Belgium would go 589 days without a government. That is almost 2 years. But wait, there's more, because that is not the most. This was a record that was broken only 10 years later in 2020, when it would go 592 days without actually being able to form a government. Like, if you could describe the Belgian political system as any one thing, it is a state that is constantly on the verge of entering into a crisis. Which leads us to a question of whether or not it is a system that should exist in the first place at all. Now, I'm not saying that that is the case, necessarily, but there are some within the country that do. As I said here in the beginning, going into this section, the parties that have taken advantage of the crisis that seems to constantly unfold within Belgium is the more right-wing oriented parties. In this case, Vlaams Belang and the New Flemish Alliance, or the NVA. And that is something that brings us to today. The things that I've been describing so far are not only occurring within Belgium. All across the EU, more right-wing oriented politics have risen in recent months as the varying different blocs battle with immigration, with slow growth, with high inflation, and this has led to populist and anti-establishment parties winning a lot of support in these varying contexts. Belgium, as an example, is one of the European countries that, due to its wealth, has been dealing with a major influx of asylum seekers, with a number of arrivals being similar to the migration crisis of 2015. And so it is that in Flanders, migration is seen as one of the #1 concerns for voters. Vlaams Belang owns the migration theme, which is very important to a lot of the Flemish people that are voting, and that, according to a number of analysts, is the primary reason for their success. The same trend is happening now all across Europe. And so because of what has been going on, there is a massive wave of unease that is felt among varying citizens who feel that they have been economically abandoned by their own elites. And as unfair as people may think that that is, more right-wing oriented populist groups have been capitalizing on this feeling. For any of the potential voters that have been looking at voting for Vlaams Belang, they see migration as the most important political issue. This, of course, being followed by taxes and economy and everything else like that. The standard stuff that you would see in most political systems. Whether or not the entire Belgian state is reformed or broken apart, well, that is something that it seems that people don't really care as much about, but really, who knows? As we talked about earlier, Belgium was created in a kind of chaotic and unplanned way, which creates this really interesting question of, could the country's demise come about as an accident from people voting specifically in a way to try and tackle migration, but then other results happen? Well, maybe. The goal of Tom van Grieken's strategy is specifically to become the biggest party in Flanders in the next elections in June, which, if he did so, would give him the prerogative to choose his coalition partner for the Flemish government. Ideally, for him, that would be the NVA. Then the Flemish government would be able to issue a declaration of sovereignty in order to force the French-speaking coalition partners to negotiate the end of Belgium as it currently exists. But of course, this is politics, and not everything is so simple. Even if Van Grieken wins, there's not necessarily any indication that the NVA is going to go and side with him. There is fierce disagreement within the party whether or not they would be willing to form a government with Vlaams Belang in the first place. And even if the NVA decides that they will work with Vlaams Belang, there's no reason to believe that the French side of the government would then be willing to show up to a debate or settle anything in the first place. Still, every single one of the steps that we've been talking about here is something that would only create further political instability in Belgium. And to be honest, that on its own could simultaneously help promote the cause for independence. We don't necessarily really know. And as for what is actually going to happen here in the end, we don't really know. We're going to need to wait a year in order to actually find out if we're going to be getting a new Flemish state. But here, Van Grieken possibly puts it best by saying, quote, "It is not because there is a Flemish national party that Belgium is imploding. It is because Belgium is not working that there is a Flemish national party." So really, only time will tell. And the final possible country that we're going to be talking about here today is Catalonia. And I have to say, before we go and begin this section, that among all the different countries that I have listed today, I would definitely argue that Catalonia is probably the least likely of the bunch. And I know that for a number of people who are in the comments right now, that is going to make them a mixture of either confused or upset, but please hear me out as I'm going to need to go ahead and explain this one. Dear God, I can already remember my Spanish teacher from back in college. She was Catalonian and very, very keen on expressing her political views in class. That was a very interesting time. Do you see this image behind me right here? This is the Estelada, or the flag of Catalonia. And that is a flag that, if you really only look at things around 10 years ago or so, this was a flag that in the region of Catalonia was being flown everywhere, proudly. People were marching through the streets, and everywhere it seems to be that all of this was a very proud statement in defense and support of Catalonia as an independent idea that people wanted to be free of control from Madrid, and an entire region within Spain was going to break free. I mean, my friends, we are talking about a time in which separatist parties effectively ran the majority of town councils, while activists were going around and marching in the street in favor of independence, all in the run-up to Catalonia's contested 2017 independence referendum, which would spark a constitutional crisis, and from that, a harsh crackdown by Spanish authorities. But as it stands today, even though we're going to be skipping past a little history for me to say this right now, little bit of that pro-independence fervor remains. The parties that supported it are out of power, the flags have been mostly taken down, and what could have been a new independent country now doesn't seem to really be happening. It seems to be more of a distant memory than anything else. And let me explain what it is that I mean. Throughout the entire region of Catalonia, support for separation from Spain has been dwindling in recent years in the face of the failure of pro-independence politicians to secure independence in the first place back in 2017, along with a growing perception that the world isn't necessarily so friendly as people thought it was. That for a new, small nation to suddenly appear, that this is something that could potentially be dangerous. And as for just how far the separatist ideals have fallen, though, well, that is something that we are not going to really find out until potentially the general elections in December of this year of 2023. But the question is, at this point, how did we get here? First off, tackling Catalonia itself and what exactly this thing is. The idea of the region of Catalonia as being something that is separate is something that has existed for not just recent times, but rather goes back hundreds of years all the way into the medieval period. This being specifically back to a time where the crown of Aragon, one of the two halves that would go on to form Spain, was its own independent power and by its own right, a very powerful trade power in the region of the Mediterranean. Of course, for anyone who has ever played Europa Universalis 4, ever since the Iberian wedding that would occur in the 15th century, tensions that had already existed between Aragon and Castile would only get worse as the nation was combined to form what would be Spain. This would continue on for many years, simmering until effectively the Catalonian side would end up being defeated after the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714, and after that, that would end its political independence, so to speak. But in the 300 years since, Catalonia has still managed to retain a separate identity. It has a separate culture, it has a separate language, and no matter how many times Madrid and Spain in general has tried to quash them, they've still persisted. In 1932, the Second Spanish Republic would restore Catalonia to a degree of regional autonomy that its leaders had been advocating for, and had already achieved to varying degrees since the late 19th century. However, with the Republic's defeat in the Spanish Civil War, Catalonia's identity was ruthlessly suppressed under General Francisco Franco's dictatorship, and it wasn't until after his death and the return of democracy in Spain that Catalonia would again have a degree of autonomy that would start in 1979 and continue from that point to be a rather influential force in Spanish politics, holding varying degrees of power at different times depending upon the makeup of the Spanish parliament. Essentially, what would happen is that if the Spanish government needed Catalan support, it would have to give in to Catalan demands and provide increased autonomy or some other kind of benefit. Otherwise, Catalonia in general, would not necessarily want to work with Spain. If we go and then fast forward a bit of time, in 2006, during the rule of a socialist government in Madrid that tended to be more sympathetic to Catalan rights, a new Statute of Autonomy would give Catalonia more cultural and political rights, was approved by both the Catalan and Spanish parliaments, and by a referendum in the region. But the Spanish Constitutional Court would gut the statute in 2010 before it could be instituted, triggering a wave of mass protest and demands for independence. Fast forward only a little bit of time, and by 2012, a poll from the Catalan government-run Center for Opinion Studies, or CEO, would show that support for independence within the region of Catalonia had grown to 57%. This momentum would also drive Catalan political parties on both the left-wing and right-wing aspects into an unprecedented coalition for independence. For the first time ever, these parties seemed to be willing to work together completely. And for a time, many people around the world, and especially in Catalonia itself, looked at this and thought, hey, this is inevitable. We're going to get our independence. It's going to happen. Mass protests became a common thing in places like Barcelona and even in some of the smaller seaside towns. Independence fervor effectively had taken hold everywhere. And the fact that in 2012, the UK agreed that Scotland was going to be able to have a referendum to determine its own independence, which though ultimately that didn't end up succeeding, that is still something that would only galvanize the population further that they too should have their own referendum. What would follow that would be the 2017 referendum. And while this referendum is something that would end up delivering a 92% vote for secession, as it turns out, the turnout for the entire thing was only 43%. So to those who would be pro-independence, it seemed to be an overwhelming majority of people wanted to be free, but the reality was significantly more complicated. The Spanish government and High Court's earlier declaration that the ballot was illegal led to anti-independence parties in Catalonia boycotting the vote entirely. And after that, what had seemed inevitable just completely fell apart. If anything, this entire situation appears to have been the opposite of what happened with the 2021 New Caledonia independence thing that we just talked about earlier in this video. But this thing was going to get pretty messy. Spanish police would crack down violently on voters. Members of the National Guard and Civil Guard, who were stationed in Catalan cities for months, would go and seize ballots and assault voters. The EU, meanwhile, didn't change its mind, refusing to recognize the Catalan right to vote in an independence referendum, let alone actually count Catalan as its own independent member of the EU. And with many key pro-independence leaders getting arrested for holding a banned ballot and others having to flee into exile in Belgium, the independence bid effectively collapsed. Since then, Catalonia has continued to preserve its own identity and language, but really, it hasn't done anything else outside of the larger Spanish state. It hasn't tried to break free. If we fast forward to more recent times, only last year, in July of 2022, a poll would show that secession support in Catalonia had dropped down to almost around 40%, which is a stark contrast from the 57% that it had about a decade earlier. Meanwhile, pro-union parties now outweigh their separatist counterparts in many parts of Catalonia, including in Barcelona itself, one of the key points that had been one of the separatist strongholds. As for why, well, I'll need to go ahead and explain that a little bit. There are a number of different factors, domestically, politically, etc., for why this shift has occurred. Disputes among pro-independence leaders over responsibility for the movement's failure and future strategy have definitely weakened the movement. Some, such as the Catalan Republican left, see that working with the current left-of-center government in Madrid is probably the best way that they would be able to secure another referendum, while others, such as the Catalan socialists, seek a federal Spain rather than an outright independent Catalonia. Others, such as the Popular Unity candidacy and the center-right Junts, argue that negotiation with the Spanish government is pointless and that they need to just do away with it altogether. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, people aren't nearly as mad at the Spanish government as they were before, as the Spanish government's handling of the cost of living crisis has actually helped to ease a lot of the tensions that people had towards them in the first place. And as electricity bills have actually managed to stay lower and people are less upset, that means that secession is less likely to be in their minds. Simultaneously, one of the other key things that Spain would do at this time is remove the sedition laws from their constitution, allowing some of the charges that had been levied against Catalan separatist leaders to be dropped, thus, once again, easing tensions. But it's not just domestic issues, because the reality is that recent international events have also delivered a series of blows to the popularity of independence. For many at the time that independence sentiments were high, Catalan independence in a globalized world is something that made a lot of sense. After all, this is a friendly world open to them. This is a great state capable of many good trade deals. It is something that the world should be able to appreciate. But in this new world, one that was filled with pandemics, war that is going on in Ukraine, increasing rivalry between the United States and China, this more deglobalized world is not necessarily something that can be as friendly, particularly towards a smaller new country like Catalonia. That is something that more than likely is going to end up being taken advantage of. And so really, where things began to die down is during the COVID-19 pandemic. People started to worry more about things that were different than what they had in the previous years. The goal of independence was something that gradually would wither away. And in particular, the EU's role in combating the pandemic would speak volumes to many citizens about the need for the EU to actually back them for an independent Catalonia in order to do anything. There appears to be a large number of people that back then that thought that the EU simply wouldn't do without Catalonia, so future membership was going to be something that absolutely was going to happen. But the EU didn't offer their support, which means that if Catalonia ended up achieving its independence, it simultaneously would not have its deals with the EU. And considering what had been going on with the United Kingdom and its performance post-Brexit, both economically and politically, this is something that has only reinforced fears about the risks of losing EU protection. As for what is actually going to happen, we don't necessarily know, because in December, Spain is set to hold elections, which is something that, depending on how the winds shift, could potentially see the movement reinvigorated again. But as it stands, much in the same way as we have seen across Europe, political parties are effectively up in the air at this moment. Due to political uncertainty, this might make the Spanish left-wing and more center-left parties more willing to work with Catalan nationalists in order to hold on to power, potentially handling the separatist parties an opportunity to be able to come together and demand a new referendum in return for support. But the reality is that we don't know. Support for a legal referendum is something that remains high among Catalans, even if it is not necessarily something that they support for independence altogether. But even then, while there is still substantial support for independence, the overall will to do anything about it seems to be relatively frozen. Because while the Spanish government could call a legal referendum, there is no suggestion that they actually would do so. Even the current Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, who actually leads the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, historically, he has been someone who was more sympathetic to Catalonia, but he has said outright in 2022 that, quote, "In Catalonia, there is not going to be any self-determination consultation." So really, could it happen? Maybe, but to be honest, the government seems to be working more against it than anything else. That all being said, Catalonia is a region that for centuries has still had a very independent identity. It is something that the idea of Catalonia being a separate entity from Spain is a very real reality to many people, and resentment towards Spanish authorities is one of the key points that builds a Catalonian identity in the first place. So could it happen? Maybe. But to be honest, like all the others, who knows? We can only tell what the future may bring once it's actually here. But everyone, with that, I think that we are going to end today's video. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate all of you. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, that would mean the world to me. And by all means, let me know what it is that we should do next in the comment section below. Again, I'm going to be doing more stuff when it comes to things with geopolitics. I want to do more stuff that is going to be deep dives into individual countries. And I found the idea of doing this as a hypothetical what-if situation with countries is very good. Simultaneously, if anyone is interested in alternate history that explores a what if something happened, that may be something that we might do as well. Who knows? Really, anything is possible when it comes to this channel because it is, after all, the history of everything. As I said, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And simultaneously, if you'd like to go on any trips with me, I'm currently leading a trip to Italy, and there is another trip that I'm going to be leading to Peru this next year. So if you want to go with me, then by all means, do join us because it's going to be an incredible amount of fun. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, my friends.